Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be doing something kind of different and really interesting. We're going to be taking a look at the state of the American community.
Oh, yeah?
And trying to figure out if it's really fallen apart like so many people seem to think. So you've given me a bunch of really interesting material to look at for this deep dive. We've got excerpts from a well-known book called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam.
Right.
We've got a review of the book that pushes back on some of its main points.
Yeah, some interesting counter-arguments there.
Yeah, and then, just some notes and stuff highlighting the key takeaways. So
great collection of sources.
Yeah, so I think today we're going to try and figure out, is there really evidence that social capital is declining in the U.S.?
Yeah, that's the big question.
And what does that even mean for our, individual well-being and for our democracy, if that is the case?
Yeah, what are the implications?
So let's jump right in. I think one of the first things that struck me when I was reading Bowling Alone was just how much evidence Putnam presents to suggest that Americans are just less engaged in civic life than they used to be.
Yeah, he really does pile on the data, doesn't he?
Yeah, like, shrinking membership in all sorts of organizations like the PTA, Lions Club.
Right, those classic community groups.
Fewer people showing up to vote or working on political campaigns.
Yeah, it's quite a list.
Yeah, and one stat that I thought was particularly striking was about leadership roles in local organizations. Between 1973 and 1994, the number of Americans actively taking on those roles plummeted by over 50%.
Wow, that is significant.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what happened, right?
Yeah, it does.
So Putnam seems to think that at least part of the explanation is generational.
Right, he talks about the greatest generation.
Right. The folks who lived through World War II, and he suggests that maybe they're just a tough act to follow.
Yeah, their level of civic engagement was really remarkable.
Right. They were all about community involvement, right?
Yeah, it's true.
So is this a case of the greatest generation versus everyone else? Is it all downhill from there?
Well, that's certainly one way to interpret it, but the critique we have here offers a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, I was going to say the reviewer really pushes back on that idea, doesn't he?
They do. They raise some interesting questions about whether this is truly a generational decline or just part of a larger cyclical pattern.
Oh, okay.
They point to some trends in recent decades, like the rise in volunteering, for example, and falling crime rates.
Oh, interesting.
As potential signs of a civic revival.
Okay, so it's not necessarily as simple as saying, younger generations just don't care or aren't as involved.
Right, there's more nuance to it.
But even if it is cyclical, the trends that Putnam highlights are still pretty significant, right? I mean, that's a big drop-off in participation.
Oh, absolutely.
So if it's not all about generational differences, what does he see as the root cause of this decline in social connectedness?
Well, he explores a few possible explanations, but one that he keeps coming back to is individualism.
Individualism.
Yeah, he argues that Americans are becoming more and more focused on their own needs and less willing to sacrifice for the collective good.
So that's where the bowling alone metaphor comes in, right?
Exactly. Instead of joining leagues and building those social bonds, we're all just off doing our own thing.
Right. And it's not just individuals. He also blames some of the social and technological forces that might be driving this shift towards individualism.
Yes.
Like, he talks a lot about television.
Yes. Television, the original social media.
Right. So what does he argue about its impact on community life?
Well, he suggests that television encourages passivity and isolation.
Right.
Instead of going out and engaging with our communities, we're just sitting at home consuming entertainment.
Right.
And that could lead to a decline in those face-to-face interactions and a weakening of social ties.
And the research he cites does seem to support that claim, right?
Okay.
There are studies showing that heavy TV watchers tend to be more distrustful of others and less involved in their communities.
Mm.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, if that was true back when TV was the dominant medium, what about the impact of smartphones and the internet today?
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other can of worms.
Right. Putnam couldn't have predicted the rise of social media, but it's certainly relevant to his arguments about technology's potential to reshape our social lives.
Absolutely. It's a natural extension of his argument.
Yeah. Okay, so before we go too far down that rabbit hole, I want to come back to something that the critic brought up because it's a really interesting counterpoint to Putnam's focus on those traditional forms of civic engagement.
You're talking about the idea of tertiary organizations.
Yeah, exactly. Can you explain that for our listeners? Because I think it really challenges how we think about measuring civic engagement.
Sure. So Putnam's focus is primarily on those traditional local organizations like bowling leagues, PTAs, things like that.
Right, where members are actively
Yes,
participating.
exactly. But the critic points out that there's been this huge rise in large-scale national organizations that are often focused on specific issues. They call these tertiary organizations. Think of groups like the AARP or the Sierra Club.
Oh, right, yeah.
They have huge memberships, but they don't necessarily require a lot of active participation beyond paying dues.
So you might be a card-carrying member, but you're not necessarily showing up at meetings or building those close relationships.
Right.
So does that still count as civic engagement in the same way?
That's the question the critic raises. Are we measuring the right things if we only look at those traditional organizations?
Right. It's like we're counting bowling balls when people have moved on to online gaming.
Yeah, good analogy.
But even with these evolving forms of engagement, the underlying question is still about social capital. Does it matter, and is it really declining?
Right, and that's where the critic gets even more pointed. They raise some fundamental questions about the validity of social capital as a concept.
Okay, so it's not just about how we measure it, but whether it's even a real measurable thing.
Exactly. The critic points out that the indicators of social capital, things like voting rates, participation in groups, and levels of trust, don't always correlate neatly.
Okay.
They argue that it might be a fuzzy concept that lumps together too many different social phenomena.
It's a good point. It's like saying health is declining based on how often people go to the gym.
Right.
Without considering diet or genetics or access to health care. You're measuring something, but is it the right thing?
That's a great analogy.
Okay, so maybe social capital is a bit slippery as a concept. But there's one aspect of it that seems pretty consistently linked to community well-being, and that's trust.
Absolutely.
And that's one area where the data is pretty clear. Generalized trust, that sense that you can rely on others, even strangers, has been declining in the U.S. for decades.
Yeah, it's a worrying trend.
And the sources we have here really highlight the implications of that, right?
Right.
Less trust makes it harder to solve collective problems, to cooperate and to build strong communities.
It's like trying to build a house without any mortar.
Right. There's this quote from the material that really stuck with me. It says, generalized reciprocity. The idea that I'll do this for you without expecting anything specific back, knowing that someone will do something for me down the road, is a community asset.
That's a powerful statement.
It really is. And it seems like that belief that we're all in this together, that's what's eroding.
Yeah, it's crucial for a functioning society.
So how do we even begin to rebuild that? But before we jump into solutions, maybe you can clarify one more thing about social capital.
Sure.
Putnam talks about bonding versus bridging capital.
Right? He does. It's an important distinction.
So can you break that down for us?
Yeah, so bonding capital refers to the strong ties we have with people who are like us,
Okay.
our family, close friends, members of our religious community.
Right.
It kind of reinforces shared identities and values within a group.
So bonding capital is like building a strong foundation within a community.
Exactly. And then bridging capital refers to the connections we build with people who are different from us. People who come from different backgrounds, hold different beliefs, belong to different social groups.
Got it.
It's about building bridges across those divides, fostering understanding and empathy, creating a more inclusive society.
So if bonding capital is the foundation, bridging capital is like building the roads and bridges that connect different communities.
I like that analogy.
Okay. So Putnam argues that both types of capital are important for a healthy society, but that bridging capital is particularly crucial for addressing things like polarization and prejudice.
Right. When we only have bonding capital, we can end up in these echo chambers.
Right. And those don't help anyone.
Not at all.
All right. So we've got bonding capital, bridging capital, this decline in trust. What else do the sources point to as contributing to this decline in social connectedness? I know we talked about individualism and television, but what are some of the other factors that are at play here?
Well, the sources delve into a whole range of factors,
Right.
including things like urbanization, immigration, globalization, and even the changing nature of work and family life.
So it's a pretty complex picture.
It is. It's a complex web of interconnected forces, and I think the sources do a good job of presenting a balanced view without oversimplifying.
Right, because these are topics that can easily veer into politically charged territory.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious how the sources handle those potentially controversial issues like immigration, for example, without taking sides.
Well, they focus on the data and the analysis,
Okay.
highlighting the nuances and avoiding those sweeping generalizations. So, for instance, on immigration, they acknowledge that rapid demographic changes can challenge existing social structures,
Okay.
but they also point out that immigrants often bring strong community ties and a history of civic engagement from their home countries.
Right. It's not a simple equation of more immigrants equals less social capital.
Exactly. It's much more nuanced than that.
So it seems like the issue isn't immigration itself, but how well communities adapt and integrate newcomers into the social fabric.
Right. It takes effort from both sides.
Yeah.
Established communities need to be welcoming and inclusive, while newcomers need to find ways to participate and contribute to their new home.
Okay, that makes sense.
And speaking of complex forces, globalization is another big one that comes up.
Right. How does that factor into this whole decline in social capital thing? Does increased interconnectedness on a global scale necessarily weaken local communities?
It's a tricky question, and the sources acknowledge that globalization has both positive and negative impacts on social capital.
Okay.
On the one hand, it can lead to economic disruption as jobs and industries move across borders.
Right. It's hard to feel connected to your community when you're worried about your livelihood.
Exactly. But on the other hand, globalization also creates opportunities for cross-cultural exchange and collaboration, which can in turn build new forms of bridging social capital.
Okay, so it's not all bad.
Not at all. Think of international organizations, online communities that connect people across borders, or even just the increased exposure to diverse cultures that comes with globalization.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
Globalization creates both challenges and opportunities, and the impact likely varies depending on the specific community and how it responds.
Exactly. It highlights the need for thoughtful policies and community initiatives that help people navigate these changes and build strong connections, even as the world becomes increasingly interconnected.
Okay. Let's tackle another potentially controversial factor,
Okay.
the welfare state. Some people argue that government assistance programs undermine individual initiative and weaken community bonds by creating dependency.
Yeah, that's a common argument.
Do the sources weigh in on that perspective?
They do. And they offer a balanced view, as always.
Okay, good.
They acknowledge that some poorly designed welfare programs might unintentionally create dependency and discourage self-reliance.
Okay.
But they also emphasize the importance of a strong social safety net for protecting vulnerable individuals and families.
Yeah. It's a complex issue for sure.
It is.
I guess the question is, how do you create a system that provides essential support without undermining people's sense of agency and their motivation to contribute to their communities?
Right. It's about finding that sweet spot where individuals feel empowered to participate and contribute, knowing that there's a safety net to catch them if they fall.
Right.
The sources suggest that this requires thoughtful policy design that focuses on empowering individuals rather than simply providing handouts.
That makes sense.
It's a delicate balance.
It is. Now, I'm curious about the source's take on the connection between social capital and crime rates. It seems intuitive that strong, connected communities would be less prone to crime.
Yeah, you would think so.
But is that borne out by the data?
Well, the sources do dig into some fascinating research on this topic, and they suggest that yes, high levels of social capital, particularly trust and social cohesion, are correlated with lower crime rates.
Okay.
When people feel connected to their communities and trust their neighbors, they're more likely to look out for each other and intervene to prevent crime.
It's like having a built-in neighborhood watch program,
Right.
but based on genuine relationships rather than just suspicion and fear.
Exactly. It goes back to that idea of generalized reciprocity. I'll do this for you knowing someone will do something for me down the road.
Right.
That mentality creates a sense of collective responsibility for the well-being of the community, and that can be a powerful deterrent to crime.
So it seems like investing in social capital can have very real, tangible benefits, not just for individuals, but for the safety and well-being of entire communities.
Absolutely. And the sources suggest that these benefits extend to the political realm as well.
Oh, interesting.
When people trust each other and believe that their voices matter, they're more likely to participate in the political process,
Right.
which strengthens our democracy.
That makes sense. If you feel disconnected from your community and disillusioned with the political system, why would you bother voting or getting involved?
Right. Apathy and cynicism set in.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got declining social capital potentially linked to higher crime rates and political apathy.
Yeah, it's a bit of a bleak picture.
It is a bit bleak. Are there any bright spots in all of this? What do the sources suggest we can do to rebuild those connections and strengthen our communities?
Oh, there are definitely bright spots. And the sources offer some really practical and inspiring ideas for rebuilding social capital. Remember how the critic pointed to the rise in volunteering as a potential sign of civic renewal?
Oh, yeah.
Well, the sources dig deeper into that trend and suggest that volunteering can be a powerful way to connect with others, develop new skills, and contribute to the common good.
So it's not just about writing a check. It's about rolling up your sleeves and getting involved.
Exactly. And the sources highlight a variety of ways to do that, whether it's volunteering at a local food bank, mentoring a young person, or participating in a community cleanup project.
It seems like the key is to find something you're passionate about and then find a way to use your time and talents to make a difference.
Absolutely. And those efforts don't have to be grand or heroic. The sources emphasize that even small acts of kindness and generosity can have a ripple effect, strengthening the social fabric of a community one interaction at a time.
It's that old adage, think globally, act locally. We can't solve all the world's problems, but we can make a difference in our own communities by being good neighbors, supporting local businesses, and getting involved in initiatives that make our neighborhoods a better place to live.
Exactly. And those efforts can be incredibly rewarding, not just for the community, but for the individual as well.
Right, you get that sense of purpose.
Yeah. Studies show that people who are actively engaged in their communities tend to be happier, healthier, and more resilient.
So it's a win-win. Investing in social capital benefits both individuals and the communities they belong to.
Yeah, everyone wins.
But before we get too carried away with all the positive impacts, I'm curious to hear more about how the sources suggest we address some of the more challenging aspects of this decline in social connectedness. For example, we talked earlier about the role of technology in potentially isolating us. How do we navigate the digital world in a way that supports social capital rather than undermines it?
That's a great question, and one that the sources tackle head on. They acknowledge that technology can be both a boon and a bane to social capital.
Right.
On the one hand, it can connect us with people we might never have met, otherwise facilitate collaboration across geographical boundaries, and provide platforms for sharing information and building communities.
Right. The internet has opened up a whole new world of possibilities.
Fear has, but the sources also caution against the potential downsides of technology.
Okay, like what?
Particularly the tendency to substitute online interactions for real-world connections,
Yeah.
to retreat into echo chambers where we only engage with people who agree with us,
Right.
and to become so absorbed in our digital devices that we miss out on the richness of face-to-face interactions.
Yeah, that's definitely something I struggle with.
Yeah, I think we all do to some extent.
So it's about using technology mindfully and intentionally as a tool for connection rather than a substitute for it.
Yeah.
So how do we do that?
Well, the sources offer some practical suggestions,
Right.
like using social media to connect with people outside our usual social circles,
Okay.
participating in online forums that encourage respectful dialogue and debate,
Right.
and making a conscious effort to limit screen time and prioritize in-person interactions whenever possible.
It's about finding that balance between the virtual world and the real world.
Exactly.
Using technology to enhance our connections rather than letting it dominate our lives.
Right.
And it's also about recognizing that even our online interactions can contribute to building social capital.
Yes, they can.
Every post we share, every comment we make, every online group we join can either reinforce division and negativity
Right.
or foster empathy, understanding, and a sense of community.
It's a powerful tool that we can use for good or for ill.
It is. It's like we're all digital citizens now, and we have a responsibility to use our online voices to build bridges rather than walls.
Well said. And just as we need to be mindful of how we use technology, we also need to be aware of the potential pitfalls of nostalgia.
Okay.
The sources caution against romanticizing the past and assuming that things were always better back in the day.
Yeah, it's easy to look back through rose-colored glasses and long for a simpler time.
Right, when everyone knew their neighbors and kids played outside until dark.
Yeah.
But the sources remind us that every era has its own challenges and complexities.
Right.
The goal isn't to recreate some idealized version of the past, but rather to learn from both the successes and failures of previous generations as we work to build stronger, more connected communities in the present.
So it's about acknowledging that things have changed, and some of those changes might be irreversible,
Right.
but also recognizing that we have the power to shape the future of our communities by making conscious choices and taking deliberate action.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the core question. What are those specific actions that individuals and communities can take to rebuild social capital and strengthen the fabric of American society?
That's what we need to figure out.
That's what I'm eager to explore in the next part of this deep dive. We've laid the groundwork by understanding the problem and the contributing factors.
Right.
But now let's get into the solutions. What practical steps can we take both individually and collectively to foster a stronger sense of community and rebuild those bonds of trust and reciprocity that seem to be eroding?
It's a big question, but I think the sources give us some good answers.
Yeah, me too. So let's take a quick break and we'll come back to that in just a moment.
Sounds good.
All right, so let's dig into those solutions. We spent a good amount of time in the last part talking about the problem, this potential decline in social capital.
Yeah, all those factors that might be contributing.
Exactly. But now I want to get to the good stuff. What can we actually do about it? What do the sources suggest?
Well, one thing that really struck me is that the sources offer a surprisingly diverse toolkit for rebuilding those connections. And it's encouraging to see that many of them are things that are within our reach.
So we're not talking about like sweeping policy changes or massive social movements or anything like that?
Not necessarily. While those things can certainly play a role, the sources really emphasize the power of small individual actions, the kind of things we can start doing today in our own lives and communities.
Okay, I like the sound of that. So give us some examples. What's like the first step someone could take if they want to start strengthening their community?
Well, one of the simplest and most effective things we can do is just reconnect with our neighbors.
Okay.
It sounds almost too basic, but in our busy lives, we often forget the importance of those everyday interactions.
You mean like actually talking to the people who live next door, not just waving from the car?
Exactly. Striking up conversations, offering help when someone needs it, organizing block parties or potlucks. These small gestures can go a long way in building that sense of community.
Yeah, it's like we've lost the art of just being neighborly.
Right. It's a muscle we need to exercise.
It reminds me of that saying, it takes a village. Maybe we need to start acting like a village again, even if our villages look a little different than they did in the past.
I love that. And creating those village-like spaces might involve thinking beyond our immediate neighborhoods as well. The sources also highlight the importance of supporting those community organizations and initiatives that bring people together.
Okay, so we're talking about things like volunteering at local charities, joining community gardens, supporting local businesses.
Exactly. These organizations provide opportunities to connect with others who share our interests, to work towards common goals, to contribute to the well-being of our community.
It's about finding those spaces where people can interact as human beings, not just as consumers or political adversaries.
Right, exactly. It's about building those human connections.
It's about supporting those existing organizations, but also maybe creating new ones, right?
Absolutely. The sources really encourage us to be creative and proactive in creating new opportunities for connection as well. Maybe it's starting a book club or organizing a neighborhood watch program.
Or even just hosting regular gatherings in our homes to bring people together.
Yeah, I love the idea of reclaiming those informal spaces for social interaction. Not everything has to be so structured and organized.
It's about finding those organic ways to connect.
Yeah, exactly. But what about the bigger picture? How do we address those kind of systemic issues that contribute to social fragmentation?
Well, the sources acknowledge that individual actions alone aren't enough. We also need to advocate for policies and initiatives that promote social inclusion, economic opportunity, a sense of belonging for everyone.
So things like affordable housing, quality education, accessible healthcare, safe public spaces, those kinds of things.
Exactly. These are the building blocks of strong communities. When people have their basic needs met and they feel a sense of security and opportunity, they're much more likely to invest in their communities and build those bonds of trust and reciprocity. It sounds like we need a multi-pronged approach, right? We need to work at both the individual level and the systemic level to create a more just and equitable society where everyone has the chance to thrive.
I agree. It's a both-hand situation.
Yeah. And it's not about waiting for someone else to take the lead, right?
Right.
Each of us has a role to play, whether it's volunteering our time, donating to worthy causes, speaking out against injustice, or simply being a good neighbor.
It all adds up.
Yeah. It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected and that our actions, however small, can have a ripple effect.
Absolutely. And sometimes those ripples can lead to waves of change. The sources also highlight the importance of engaging in public discourse and participating in the political process.
Okay, so getting involved in like town hall meetings, contacting our elected officials, organizing around issues we care about.
Exactly. Civic engagement is crucial for creating a more just and responsive society.
I know. But that can feel really daunting. especially in today's political climate. It's so polarized. It's so divisive. It's tempting to just like tune out the noise and retreat into our own little echo chambers.
I understand that feeling, but the sources remind us that silence is not a solution. We need to engage in those difficult conversations, listen to diverse perspectives, find ways to bridge those divides, even when we disagree.
It's about recognizing that democracy requires participation, even when it's messy and uncomfortable.
It does. It's not always pretty.
Right.
Yeah.
But those conversations don't have to be like, grand political debates or anything.
Right.
They can start with something as simple as a shared meal.
Oh, I love that.
The sources actually talk about that.
They do.
The power of breaking bread together, of sharing food and stories as a way to connect with others and build relationships across differences.
It's such a powerful symbol of community.
It is. It's about creating those spaces of hospitality and warmth where people feel welcome and valued and connected, regardless of their background or beliefs.
Right. It's about creating that sense of belonging.
And it's not just about those like formal events, right?
Yeah, not at all.
It could be as simple as inviting a neighbor over for coffee, or organizing a potluck with colleagues, or striking up a conversation with someone new at a community event.
It's about being open to connection, even in those unexpected places.
I like that, being open to connection.
Mhm.
But speaking of unexpected places, we've talked a lot about those real-world interactions.
Right.
But what about the role of technology in all of this? Can we harness the power of the digital world to build social capital?
That's a great question. And the sources offer some really interesting insights on that front. They acknowledge that technology can be a double-edged sword, but they also emphasize its potential for good.
Okay, so it's not about demonizing technology. It's about using it wisely and intentionally.
Exactly.
So how do we do that?
Well, the sources encourage us to use technology to connect with people outside our usual social circles,
Okay.
to engage in those meaningful conversations online, and to support causes we believe in.
So using social media to amplify voices that are often unheard,
Yeah.
participating in online forums that encourage respectful dialogue,
Yeah.
or even just using those platforms to organize community events and initiatives.
All of that. And it's also about being mindful of how our online interactions impact others.
Right.
You know, we can choose to use our digital voices to spread kindness, understanding, and a sense of community.
Yeah.
Or we can contribute to the negativity and division that often permeates online spaces.
Right. It's like we're all digital citizens now.
We are.
And we have a responsibility to create a more positive and inclusive online culture.
I agree. And just as we need to be mindful of our online behavior, we also need to be wary of that tendency to romanticize the past. The sources caution against assuming that things were always better in some bygone era.
Yeah, it's tempting to look back through those rose-colored glasses
It is.
and long for a simpler time when everyone knew their neighbors and communities felt more connected.
Right. But the sources remind us that every era has its own unique challenges, and that the goal isn't to recreate some idealized version of the past,
Right.
but to learn from the experiences of previous generations as we work to build stronger, more connected communities in the present.
So it's about acknowledging that things have changed, and some of those changes might be irreversible, but also recognizing that we have the power to shape the future of our communities by making those conscious choices and taking deliberate action.
Exactly.
And that brings us back to that core question. What are those specific actions that individuals and communities can take to rebuild social capital and strengthen the fabric of American society? I think that's a great place to pick up in the next part.
Yeah, let's dive into those specifics.
Okay, so we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back with more of the deep dive. All right, so let's dive into those specific actions. We talked about a lot of kind of big picture stuff, individualism, globalization, technology, all those forces that might be shaping our community.
Yeah, those big trends.
Right. But now I want to get down to brass tacks. What can we actually do, in our daily lives to start rebuilding social capital? What are some practical steps?
Well, the sources actually offer some really concrete suggestions. And one of the simplest ones, believe it or not, is just to get to know our neighbors.
Okay. So like actually talking to the people who live next door, not just waving as we drive by.
Exactly. Striking up conversations, offering a helping hand when someone needs it, maybe organizing a block party or a potluck.
Right.
Those small gestures can really go a long way in creating that sense of community.
Yeah. It seems like we've kind of lost the art of just being neighborly, Everyone's so busy, so focused on their own lives.
It's true. We've gotten out of the habit.
Yeah. And it's a shame because those connections, even if they're just casual, They really do make a difference.
They do. They create that sense of belonging, that feeling that we're part of something larger than ourselves.
It's that old adage, it takes a village, right? Maybe we need to start acting like a village again, even if our villages look a little different than they did, 50 years ago.
I love that. And creating those village-like spaces might involve thinking beyond our immediate neighborhoods, too.
Okay.
The sources also talk about the importance of getting involved in community organizations and initiatives.
Oh, wait. So like volunteering at a local charity or joining a community garden or supporting our local businesses?
Exactly. Those organizations provide opportunities to connect with others who share our interests, work towards common goals, contribute to the well-being of our community.
And maybe even make some new friends along the way.
Exactly. It's about building those relationships.
So it's not just about like showing up and doing the work. It's about connecting with the people who are doing it alongside us.
Right. It's about creating those bonds.
Okay. So we've got the neighborly stuff. We've got the community organizations. What else?
Well, the sources also encourage us to be proactive, not just joining existing organizations, but maybe starting our own.
Okay. Like what?
Could be anything, really. Starting a book club, a hiking group, a neighborhood watch program.
Right.
Or even just hosting regular potlucks or game nights at our homes. Just creating those informal spaces for people to come together.
I love that. Because it doesn't have to be anything fancy or complicated.
Right. It's about creating those opportunities for connection, however they arise.
Okay, so we've got a lot of ideas for those individual level actions. But what about the bigger picture? How do we address those systemic issues that we talked about earlier, the things that might be contributing to this decline in social capital on a larger scale?
Right. Well, the sources acknowledge that individual actions alone aren't enough.
Okay.
We also need to advocate for policies and systems that support strong communities.
So we're talking about things like affordable housing, quality education, accessible health care, a strong social safety net, those kinds of things.
Exactly. Those are the building blocks of thriving communities. When people have their basic needs met and feel safe and supported, they're much more likely to invest in their communities and build those social connections.
Right. It's hard to care about your neighbors when you're struggling to make ends meet or worried about putting food on the table.
Exactly. So advocating for policies that address those fundamental needs is crucial.
Okay, so we've got this two-pronged approach, right?
Yeah.
We need to work at both the individual level and the systemic level.
Right. It's a both-hand situation.
Okay. And it's not about waiting for someone else to fix it, right?
No, definitely not.
Each of us has a role to play, however big or small. Whether it's volunteering our time, donating to worthy causes, speaking out against injustice, voting in elections.
Right.
All those things matter.
They do. They all contribute to building a stronger and more connected society.
And I think that's what's so powerful about the message in these sources. It's not about feeling overwhelmed or powerless in the face of these huge social trends. It's about recognizing that we all have agency, that we can all make a difference.
Absolutely. And that even small acts of kindness and connection can ripple outwards, creating a more positive and hopeful future for ourselves and our communities.
It's about choosing hope over despair, action over apathy, connection over isolation.
Well said.
And I think that's a great place to leave it. We've covered a lot of ground today, but hopefully we've given our listeners some food for thought and some inspiration to go out and make a difference in their own communities.
I hope so too. Even if it's just one small act of kindness at a time, every little bit counts.
It really does. So thanks for joining me for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.